Next up, we have Rondale Moore, the wide receiver out of Purdue, who very well may be one of the biggest boom or bust prospects in this entire draft class, in all honesty, right? We're talking about a guy who has played only 7 games over the past 2 seasons, which has to be alarming, right? The red flags have to be going off. And just to read you a little bit of his injury history, he missed most of 2019 with a hamstring injury, 3 games of 2020 this past year due to an unspecified lower body injury, as well as having had surgery on his finger between the 2019 and 20 seasons, which caused him to miss some time just behind the scenes, obviously. That's interesting, right? Because first and foremost, other than maybe a Walker Little, I can't think of anybody who's missed more games, right? At least that I've done to this point. With opt outs, we've said the question is where have they trended, up or down since we've seen them last. Well, we've seen Rondale in, kind of bits and pieces, but can he withstand a season at this point, right? That has to be the primary concern first and foremost. If he can, however, you are getting perhaps one of the most explosive players that we've seen come out in quite some time. Just to give you guys, his pro day numbers, by example, you have a guy with a 42.5-inch vertical, a guy with a 10.6 broad jump, a 4.32 40-yard dash, which, I heard times unofficially we're in the 4.28s, 4.29s in that range. So regardless, incredibly fast, right? You're looking at a guy who ran a 4.1 shuttle and it has a 6.68 3-cone. So you look at those numbers and you're like, wow, that's wildly impressive. And then you also have to look at the size measurements that he had, right? 5'7" flat at his pro day, which is a cause for pause, obviously, as well as 181 in terms of his weight. So certainly some question marks there. I know, an interesting guy, right? Because you look at the effectiveness that he had in 2018 as a freshman, and it was through the roof. And you look at the sort of, as I said, bits and pieces of production that he's had in 2019 and 2020, and it's certainly there. And you put him on film, and you see flashes, but it's just a question of are you going to get him even on the field on a week-to-week basis at the next level? Because like I said, if you do get him on the field, you're getting certainly an impressive guy, right? As you're going to see here on my grade. First and foremost, in terms of his route running, I felt like he was one of the better guys that we've watched, right? I have him better than Chase, better than Terrace Marshall Jr., in large part due to the fact that his just sort of quickness in and out of his breaks is so crisp, right? And that's what you're going to see on the next grade as well. 15 out of 15. I don't think it gets much better than Rondale Moore. I know, not to kind of spoil a grade coming down a little bit in terms of his rack ability, but he's made just flat more people miss after the catch than any receiver in the nation, according to PFF, I believe it was. And I can certainly see why, right? A lot of it comes down to that speed and quickness, as well as some of the agility and elusiveness as we get into that grade. But either way, just an absolute freakish athlete in a t-shirt and shorts, as we saw in the pro day numbers, as well as in a helmet and shoulder pads on the field, as we saw him sparingly in that sort of small sample size that we saw of him on film over these past couple of years. Otherwise, in terms of his hands and consistency, I would say it's certainly a concern. He already doesn't have the biggest catch radius, which kind of more so comes into effect with the size grade down there as a 1 out of 5. But I think even balls that are thrown catchable and to him, I almost think that he's trying a little bit too hard to plan ahead in terms of what he's going to do on the ground afterwards, right? And I understand it. When you're so dynamic, you're always looking to turn that 3-yard drag route into a 75-yard touchdown, by example. But I just wish sometimes he saw that ball in to his hands through that process a little bit more and then took off as a runner, right? I think sometimes he can just get ahead of himself in that regard. Otherwise, occasionally I feel like uses his body to assist him in catching the ball at times. Obviously, that's a little bit of a concern, but not to the point where he deserves much lower than that. I had him slightly above Terrace Marshall Jr., but otherwise certainly below that sort of top 4 group of guys that we've seen so far. Otherwise, I also felt like there were obvious concerns in terms of contested catches, right? Not a overly physical guy in that regard. He can climb the ladder of sorts, but at his size, 5'7", regardless of a 42.5-inch vertical, it's just going to be tough for him to win those 50-50 jump ball scenarios, as well as sort of those balls in traffic over the middle, right? And I did think that was sort of a cause for some of his drops as well. Just those sort of plays where he's catching and boom, getting hit, right? I think that was also a little bit of a cause for concern, right? Like, running him across the middle, by example, right? You're giving him a chance to get open, sure, but at the same time, if there's a linebacker crashing down on him, or if a defensive back, a safety, for example, gets a good jump on the ball and is going to meet him at that catch point. Moore just doesn't really have that physicality to be able to play through the contact and secure the catch, right? So I think those two grades sort of go hand in hand together. I think there are certainly questions in that regard, right? The only thing I will say is when you get the ball in his hands, as you'll see with that rack ability, and as I talked about already, just deadly, right? And in that regard, I would say, probably going to use him sort of how the 49ers use a guy like Debo, right? Where always constantly in motion, right? There's going to be jet sweeps. There's going to be fake jet sweeps. There's going to be occasional just straight handoff. There's going to be wide receiver screens galore, right? Just a lot of stuff sort of short and underneath, as well as half the time just flat giving him the ball just to see what he can do with it after the fact, because he's wildly dangerous in that regard. Otherwise, I did miss tracking body control where I felt like he was very solid. I know for Terrace Marshall Jr., by example, I talked about here his ability to adjust midair and kind of contort his body to haul in those high point catches. Well, there's a lot less of that with Moore. He's more so in the mold of, say, a Tyler Lockett, where when I'm talking about his body control and tracking, it comes down a lot of the times to what he can do sort of along the sidelines, right? You see these diving catches. You see these great toe taps along the sidelines. You see just some fantastic stuff in that regard, right? Just contorting his body. And, maybe it's less so on a vertical plane like a guy like Marshall or sometimes Jamar Chase would be, but maybe more so on the horizontal plane, right? In terms of, making plays that just he had no business of making by laying out for a grab, by example, and those sort of things. I felt like he was very good there. And, in large part, you could probably credit that some due to his sort of lower center of gravity, right? He's closer to the ground. You look at his sort of quick feet as a runner, right? And you can understand and see why he'd be able to have so much success getting both feet down inbounds as he's laying out for a nice catch, right? Just by example, I thought he was very solid there. In terms of his release, I'd say there's some concerns, right? Obviously because of his size, but again, sort of as I talked about in the Devonta Smith video, there is sort of that inherent threat with the guy with his athletic ability to where he can just beat you, right? And with his foot quickness, right, it is a risky business to just decide, oh, I'm going to press him at the line of scrimmage, right? And obviously you're going to have less of those opportunities at the slot regardless, where he's probably going to play most of his reps, but it's tough as a cornerback when the guy across from you is quicker than you, faster than you, more fluid than you, right, in and out of his cuts. If you're gonna try and press him at the line of scrimmage, you better not miss, right? And I felt like Moore did a very good job of, even when presented with those opportunities, making guys miss and making them pay in that regard. So I felt like he was solid there. Otherwise, in situations other than press, I felt like he did a great job of varying things up, keeping guys guessing, and that sort of compounds, as we talked about in his route running grade, in just his ability to be so quick that if there's any sort of misdirection, the cornerback has to almost jump on it immediately, right? And I think that really served him well, particularly on some of the more downfield routes that he would have. Did a great job in that regard. In terms of blocking and physicality, I'll be honest, I just gave him a flat 1. Didn't seem super interested in blocking. Probably shouldn't be either, right? At 5'7", I can understand why he would be a bad blocker opposed to, say, a guy like Chase or Marshall, who were sort of similarly disappointing. I will say I was surprised at his bench press reps. I didn't talk about that earlier, but 24 reps out of Moore was highly impressive to me. I just wish that I saw that a little bit more in terms of, hey, you're coming from the slot, blocking down on this linebacker or safety, give it to him a little bit, right? I think that he could have done a slightly better job, but as a guy with his injury history and durability concerns and just general stature and mass, I understand why you wouldn't want him really laying the hammer down on some of these other defensive players, right? I see why you'd kind of keep him away from the line of fire in that regard. And then lastly, in terms of athleticism, since I already touched on his size, obviously, I give him a 4.75. If anything, you could probably argue that should be a 5, but I put him there personally. So last but not least, overall, that comes out to a 74.5. Put that on the big board after adding in the position premium. And what you're going to see is he sort of splits the difference in my mind between Rashad Bateman, who's up there at the top of the second round, and Terrace Marshall, who's sort of down there at the bottom of the second round. The only thing I'll say, and this is a major caveat, right, is, again, I've said it before, I'm not a doctor by any means, right? So I don't have a durability grade built in. I don't have a red flag grade built in to where, if we're getting some negative questions rising on the medical examinations and whatnot behind the scenes, he would most certainly be further down on the big board, right? And you can almost guarantee that there are questions in that regard with that sort of laundry list of injuries and just straight injury concerns. So would I actually take him ahead of Terrace Marshall? That would be the real question. And honestly, without those medicals, I can't really give you a concrete answer, right? I would say if everything checked out and the doctor just gave me a salute and said it's up to the film, then yes, I would take him ahead of Marshall. But without having that knowledge sort of behind the scenes, I would say that it's sort of up in the air, right? As of right now, then that sort of has him as my wide receiver 5, obviously behind the sort of big 3 at the top, Chase, Waddle, and Smith, as well as then Bateman there, as you can see at the top of the second. But it's tough to find a good spot for Moore, in all honesty, because there are so many questions surrounding his game, right? Whether it's the small sample size, whether it's just his small size, or whether it's the durability concerns that kind of come off the back of that due to his injury history, right? I think that there's just a lot of questions there to where, would I draft him in the second round? It's tough because when you get the ball in his hands, he's almost like no other. He's this sort of Swiss Army knife to the highest of levels, right? Like I said, you'd want to use him sort of like the 49ers used Debo, maybe how the Jaguars, by example, have used Laviska Shenault, maybe how the Panthers previously have used a Curtis Samuel. And the question then is just, could he sustain and remain healthy during all those touches and carries and receptions and those sort of things? I think that if he can, and your team drafts him potentially in later round 2, early round 3, I think that you potentially could have a steal. If he can't, I think that, like I said, you might be looking at a guy who unfortunately never really finds his footing in the league. But with that being said, if you enjoyed this video and think I have some footing on this sort of YouTube football game, make sure you guys not only leave a thumbs up, make sure you leave a comment, and lastly, subscribe, right? Obviously, have some more receivers to go that you're not going to see unless you hit that subscribe button and are constantly in the loop for my future uploads. And other than that, if you've missed out on previous uploads, make sure you click the playlist that should have just popped up on the screen. Right around, we're approaching 70 videos at this point, right? 70 different prospects. So I've certainly been working hard on my end to try and get as many of these videos out to you guys as I can. I hope that you guys are at the very least enjoying them, right? So if you are, make sure you subscribe, make sure you hit that notification bell, do everything and anything that you can to support the channel, because it is always greatly appreciated. So that being said, that is all I have for you guys in this one. I'm mic'd up, now I'm mic'ing out. Peace, guys.